All right, so we're going to talk about chronic responses to the cold. All right, chronic responses to the cold, sorry. So really, we've got a couple of things here. So we've got a couple of rules, and then we've got the process of becoming acclimatized to the cold. So first with these rules. So there have been a bunch of studies done, and a couple of guys came up with or noticed some things as they were doing their research. So the first one's Bergmann, and Bergmann says or has found that individuals in cold environments have a greater body mass. So they have decreased surface area to mass ratio. Okay, so I want you to think about, or if you know, so people that live in really cold places, so like the native Alaskans, they're generally shorter but stockier. Okay, and this allows them to retain heat. Okay, they don't have high surface area, which means less places that they can lose heat. So that's what Bergmann came up, and then ironically, Allen came up with essentially the exact opposite. All right, and so they both got a rule named after them. So he found that individuals in warm environments normally possess longer appendages. So in other words, they have a greater ability to lose heat. They've got greater surface area. Okay, so really, the further you live away from the equator, the heavier you become for your height. All right, and so we see this there are some tribes in Africa, in some of the warmer areas in Africa near the equator, where these groups of people are notoriously tall, okay, and slender, which allows them to lose heat relatively easily. So we're going to talk a little bit about some comparative physiology here. And so comparative physiology is really cool. They're some of the coolest people I've ever met in science. And what they do is they learn about animals, and they learn how animals have adapted to a specific environment or some specific physiological challenge. And then we can use that to help understand humans and how we adapt as well. And so one of these that I want to talk about, we're going to talk about two, I believe, is the Arctic fox. Okay, the Arctic fox, look at this. He's a cute little guy. He's a relatively small animal, and generally small animals struggle in the cold because they have a high surface area to volume ratio. But the Arctic fox is able to survive because he's got thick fur, and that thick fur insulates, and that insulation is especially important when it's somewhere that's windy, right? So a couple days ago, I was out at a cross-country meet, and it was cold. It was, 30, 40 degrees, but the wind, it was so windy that day, and that just exacerbates the cold. It just makes it feel so much worse than it actually is. And this is where that idea of the wind chill comes from. So then we've got emperor penguins, and maybe you've seen March of the Penguins, maybe you haven't, but they are able to survive despite living in the harshest environment, or one of the harshest environments in the world. Okay, so they do this by standing on their heels and their tails and that sort of thing, and they just basically make themselves as small as possible. Now, birds are warm-blooded, have a high metabolic activity, able to generate their own heat, but in this kind of environment, they can't generate enough heat to make sure that their core temperature stays around 38 degrees Celsius. And so what they do, which is what we learned by watching March of the Penguins, or what the general population learned, was they get together in a big group, and they constantly cycle. They do this really cool dance, ballet, whatever you want to call it, as they cycle towards the center and then back out towards the middle. And so everybody kind of gets their turn where they're the ones basically blocking the cold and the wind for everybody else, and then they get into that nice, really warm center to heat up, and then they slowly move back out. Okay, and so together, really what they're doing is they're reducing their surface area as a whole, and so they're not losing as much heat together as they would individually. All right, and so after we become acclimatized to the cold, or as we start, we go through a couple of things. And so this is where Young's model of acclimatization comes from. Okay, so with Young's model of acclimatization, first of all, we have to be in a situation where we become acclimatized. So we have to have repeated exposure to cold stress. All right, and so there's going to be a couple of ways we can go. We've got this nifty little flow chart. So are you losing body heat after repeated exposure to chronic cold, or repeated exposure to the cold? If the answer is no, you've experienced what's called cold habituation. Now, with cold habituation, there are two main parts to this. Now, important to know that habituation is a desensitization, or in other words, it's a reduced normal response to a stressor that you've incurred a lot. Okay, in other words, you're getting used to it. All right, and so with cold habituation, there are two primary components. One is you have blunted shivering. In other words, it gets cold outside, you don't start shivering as much or as early. And then two, you have blunted cutaneous vasoconstriction. Okay, in other words, your body's adapted that you don't need to decrease skin blood flow as much as you did initially. All right, and so this is that desensitization. So it's a smaller than normal response. If we start to lose body heat, then we have to go to this, we have to answer this next question. So are we increasing our metabolic heat production in a manner that will defend body temperature? In other words, will it maintain body temperature? The answer is yes, we're experiencing what is called metabolic acclimatization. Okay, so metabolic acclimatization has two components. All right, so we have what's called enhanced shivering thermogenesis. In other words, you shiver, you have these increased muscle contractions. You also might experience what's called enhanced non-shivering thermogenesis. Okay, and this is with something that's called brown fat. Okay, brown fat is a type of fat that's actually more similar to skeletal muscle than it is to fat. It's brown in color. Generally, babies have it, but then it goes away over time. And then people that are constantly outside in ridiculously cold environments, their body starts to produce this. Okay, and this is like the thing that I say is like a Norwegian lumberjack. That's somebody that has brown fat, somebody that's outside really cold for a long period of time. And so what brown fat does is it's essentially the same thing, goes through the same thing as muscle contractions, but there's where some of the energy that's used or that's released for shivering has to go to actually causing the muscles to contract. So we're not completely efficient. Well, with brown fat, it goes through a similar process, but there's no muscle contraction. So all the energy that's released is released as heat. And so it's a little more efficient. Okay. We also have a shift. We don't rely as much on carbohydrates when we've reached or when we've experienced metabolic acclimatization. In fact, we're relying more on lipids. And this allows us to hold on to carbs longer, right? And that's important. You know, as we go, and especially when we want to do endurance stuff, we want to have as many carbs as possible. Now, if we don't experience metabolic acclimatization, then we're going to experience what's called insulative acclimatization. And generally speaking, you experience one or the other. You don't experience both metabolic and insulative acclimatization. Now, with insulative acclimatization, shocker, there are two components to this. Okay, and with this, we have greater vasoconstriction. So we're really reducing blood flow to our skin. Okay, this increases the core to skin gradient. Okay, so this means we've got greater temperature in our core than our skin. Okay, that doesn't sound great because that makes it easier to lose heat. All right, but because of number one, because of this reduced skin blood flow, that actually prevents us from losing extra heat. Okay, so it's kind of a chicken egg thing here. So we reduce our skin blood flow. That causes us to have greater heat in our core, but then that also increases the gradient between the core and the skin that would cause us to lose a lot of heat, but because we're not sending a lot of blood to our skin, that actually reduces how much heat we've lost. And so those are the main responses to chronic exposure in the cold.